Hello, everyone. Welcome to the spring meeting and the annual meeting, the spring lecture and the annual meeting of the Chevy Chase Historical Society. I'm Angela Lancaster, and I'm honored to be president of this wonderful organization. I'd like to quickly acknowledge our board members who are here, who've worked so valiantly to get this program together, and also their spouses. Could you just, everybody who's a board member has a ticket like this. Could you just wave your hands and let everybody know who you are? Okay. And also want to recognize Gail Sansbury, our wonderful director of the archives, who is back at the back. Yay, Gail. You will find on your seats, or you have found on your seats, our new membership brochure, which I urge you all to fill out and join us if you haven't already done so, and to also enjoy reading the new brochure. Thank you, Mary Ann Hoffman, for getting this new brochure done for us. Also, you'll find on your seats an evaluation form, which we kindly ask that everyone fill out after the lecture, and we will pass a basket around, collect your answers, and we will have a drawing. Ooh. A drawing. The prize will be our DVD, our award-winning DVD, and our wonderful book on the history of Chevy Chase, place names of Chevy Chase. So please fill out the forms. Now, before I turn it over to Mary Sheehan, who will introduce our lecturer, we need to have a brief annual meeting, which is required by our bylaws. So this is the beginning of the annual meeting. At the back of the room, if you're interested, is an annual report for the year 2015 that tells you a little bit about what happened last year and has our income and expense statement on it. The other thing that happens at the annual meeting is it's time for us to elect 2 new board members. So the nominees for members at large of the board of directors to serve 3-year terms, and if you would stand or wave your hands, Jean Sperling and Alex Weiner. All in favor to elect them for a 3-year term, please say aye. Aye. All opposed? Okay, good. Thank you so much. Whoa, we got that done. Now, here is Mary Sheehan to introduce our lecturer. Thank you. And thank you for your patience.
Welcome again, everyone. John DeFerrari is our speaker today. He was born and raised here in Washington, D.C. He's had a lifelong passion for the history of his hometown and its environs. While he's worked for many years as an analyst for the federal government, his first love is digging up little-known facts about the history of the nation's capital and the surrounding areas like Chevy Chase. After admiring Washington's beautiful buildings and public spaces for many years, in 2009, John began writing about them in his popular blog on local history called Streets of Washington. He's also a trustee of the D.C. Preservation League, and in that role actively works to preserve the built environment of the nation's capital city. John is a graduate of the Catholic University of America and also has a master's degree in English literature from Harvard University. Today, John will be talking about his recently published book, Capital Streetcars, Early Mass Transit in Washington, D.C. He will, among other things, explore how the advent of the streetcar gave rise to Chevy Chase, one of America's first streetcar suburbs. John's book will be on sale in the entry hall after his talk, and he will be there inscribing and signing his book as well. Chevy Chase Historical Society has made its own contribution to telling the story of the streetcar in our award-winning documentary that Angela mentioned earlier, A Streetcar to Home. This also recounts the streetcar's role in the development of Chevy Chase. So these will also be on sale at our table in the entryway afterwards. Finally, the Historical Society will continue our exploration of streetcar history with a history go-round tour of the National Capital Trolley Museum on Saturday, April 9th, beginning at noon. At our table out in the entry hall, we have information about the tour, and you can make a reservation there as well. So please stop by there after the talk as well. So with that, please join me in welcoming John DeFerrari.
Well, thank you, Mary. And wow, great crowd to come out this afternoon and hear about streetcars in Washington and Chevy Chase. So thank you all for being here. And it's a pleasure. We had a couple of tense moments there getting the slides set up, but we're good to go. So I'm going to talk, again, my book is, of course, about the whole 100-year history of streetcars in Washington and the suburbs. So I'm going to sort of give context. I'm going to talk about Chevy Chase, but I'm going to talk more broadly about the rest of the city to try to put it, as I said, put it all in context. So let's see here. All right, we're good to go on the slides. Okay, before streetcars. DC in general, of course, was much smaller in the 19th century before Chevy Chase and so many others. Still always had a problem getting people getting around. It was laid out, as you know, as a planned city, and the important parts of the city were spread out. It didn't just grow from a small settlement the way lots of other towns did. And as a result, there was always the issue of getting around. The best you had before streetcars were these contraptions that look like stagecoaches. This is an omnibus, a DC omnibus, and the driver sat on this little perch here, up here, and passengers got in these little steps in the back, and they sat in benches along each side. It could hold maybe 8 or 10 people. These were rickety devices that were very inefficient. They didn't work well on the rutted, muddy dirt roads of DC, and everyone really wanted something much better.
How were they powered?
Horses. So yeah, the horse is going to be here, and it's just cut off in this picture. So why streetcars? That's the next thing. Why were streetcars the answer? And the answer is the horses. So basically, in the 19th century, the only practical method of power for any kind of transit was going to be a horse inside the city. You had steam locomotives on railroads, but they were too big and cumbersome and disruptive to go inside cities. The only thing you had were horses. Horses pulling, so what can a horse pull? Well, a wagon like an omnibus, it could pull maybe about 3 tons on a good road, which there weren't many of. It could pull 10 tons on rails. So the streetcars were a way to leverage the power of the horse. That's really what it comes down to. They were more comfortable. You could also have, of course, the wheels are much smaller, which means it's easier to get on and off of a streetcar than it is an omnibus. So it was more comfortable for passengers, and they could carry more, and that's why streetcars were invented, really. They started appearing in cities around the country in the 1850s. The first one was proposed in D.C. in 1852. We didn't get one until 1862. And that, of course, is, wrong button. And that was, you can imagine who was responsible for delaying endlessly the decision to implement streetcars. So, of course, everything had to be chartered by Congress, so that was the issue. Once we were in the middle of the Civil War in 1862, it was pretty obvious we got to do this thing. And in fact, the charter for the first railroad, which was called the Washington to Georgetown, it ran along Pennsylvania Avenue, basically, from Georgetown, worked its way past the White House, south of the Capitol, down to the Navy Yard. And that the charter for that railroad required them to have their first segment up and running in 60 days. In the middle of the Civil War, when they had trouble getting supplies to the city. So, and they made that target. They had the first segment on Pennsylvania Avenue between the Capitol and the White House in 60 days. The whole original railroad of 3 lines in about 3 months. So it was easier to build a railroad then. Not any easier to get it approved, but easier to actually build it. This particular photo here of a streetcar right in front of the Capitol is of the second line, which was called the Metropolitan Line. It was chartered 1864, just 2 years later after the first one. Streetcars really proliferated after the first one finally got going. They were all set up as separate independent companies. And then I've got a map here of which, of course, you can't see all that detail, but this is by 1880 we had about 5 different lines running. All these early lines were run as separate chartered corporations, independent of each other, competing with each other. And so here we have. What you see here is the L'Enfant City, of course, the original part of the city, what was called Washington City at the time. The first line was this one here, and there were several others all around here. Important north-south lines on 7th Street and 14th Street. And this is the full extent of the early lines. You can see none of them went outside of the L'Enfant City, except for this one line that I'm going to talk about in a second. And why do you think that is that they didn't go outside the L'Enfant City? Not so many people out there in Washington County. The expense, I don't know. I think people were willing to do it. The biggest problem is that the reason the city is laid out as it is because more or less all around here you have hills. And the horses couldn't pull the cars up the hills. So horse-drawn railways were bound to the original city. And in the same way that essentially development was bound to the original city too. If you couldn't have a transit to a suburb, well, you couldn't. It wouldn't work. All you had outside the main city was a rural area with farmhouses and such. You couldn't have any extensive development without some way for people to get in and out efficiently. So the first suburban streetcar line is this little one hanging off the end here. That was really the only one that happened in the horse-drawn era, and that was the Anacostia and Potomac Railway. And here's one of their cute little cars that ran across the Navy Yard Bridge. Of course, going across the Anacostia to the eastern side of the Anacostia didn't require going up any hills, so that one was possible. The story of that, just very briefly, it's an interesting cautionary tale of building suburban streetcar line, the Anacostia and Potomac. It was chartered in 1872 and took a long time for them to raise money. Someone talked about raising money. An investor from Connecticut moved down to Anacostia in 1874 by the name of Henry Griswold, and he was a big promoter and developer, and he helped raise the money to get the streetcar line running, and it finally got going in 1876. Everybody was thrilled to be able to have transportation into the city. The quote in the Evening Star, "The citizens of Uniontown in East Washington," which are their early names, Anacostia, "are delighted and patronize the road so well as to exceed the expectations of the company." Everything was doing great. Then they expanded the line. I've got here, this is, again, you can't see the details of this, but so here's the Anacostia. This is, southwest Washington. So the road crossed over the bridge to Anacostia, and then they expanded and built out these lines to the waterfront, up here to Center Market, over here to Congressional Cemetery. They were going gangbusters, expanding this line. But by the late 1880s, they were in lots of trouble. They did not have enough patrons to really make a profit on the line, and Griswold started cutting back on lines because there just weren't enough people on it. In fact, this little line off to Congressional Cemetery got the nickname of the Ghost Line because nobody was on it. People said that empty cars would go there at night. In fact, no cars were going there because he was cutting them off. There was a huge strike. He cut all the salaries of his conductors and operators. The line eventually went bankrupt and was absorbed into a whole bunch of other bankrupt lines to create one of the large lines in the 20th century. But it was the cautionary tale of the suburban lines is they're built with great excitement and exuberance up front, but then they become very difficult to sustain financially over a long term. So we'll see a little bit more about that as we go along. Okay, this gets us towards the end of the horse-drawn era. Obviously, we had to do something. We had to do better than horses. They were, for one thing, they were very slow. Even if we had, even if Maryland were perfectly flat, and you were able to have horse-drawn streetcars go out to Chevy Chase, how long would it take to get? How fast do you think an average streetcar drawn by a horse traveled? Do we have 3 miles an hour? That's correct. 3 miles an hour. So that original line from Georgetown to the Navy Yard, if you got on that streetcar at one end, it would take you a full hour to get to the other end. That's not bad. Yeah. These days. On Wednesday, yes. Right. Good point. Keep everything in perspective. Yeah, we needed something to go a little faster than 3 miles an hour. And besides the horses, I mean, this was actually cruelty to horses. I have a whole section in the book about that. I don't have time to go through it all now, but we needed to get beyond horses. Congress finally mandated that the DC streetcars move beyond horses. They set a timeline in the early 1890s. It was phased in. It's complicated, but the companies were all required to move to a new form of transportation. So what were the options? The first main one, again, I got a lot in the book about it, and I will just talk about it very quickly now, is cable cars. Cable cars are actually a lot of fun to learn about. I never, before I did all the research on this, I hadn't really, I guess I had a fuzzy idea, cable cars, sort of trolley cars, what's the difference? I don't know, right? Well, cable cars are quite unique, and they are very different than electric trolleys like the ones that came to Chevy Chase. They essentially work on like a clothesline, for lack of a better term. Underground, underneath the trolley line, is a massive steel cable that's run on a loop, a continuous loop, that's powered. There's the power station at the very end, steam-powered station, that keeps that loop continuously running, and the cable car has an arm that reaches down and grabs hold of that cable and gets pulled along. Very simple, direct system. It's very complicated mechanically. Requires a lot of engineering. You got to build those conduits and have the cable running, and how do you get around corners? It's very complicated, and it turned out to be very expensive to maintain. DC had this one system, the original Washington Georgetown line that I mentioned downtown, converted to cable for a while, and it worked well, but it was overtaken by a much more a much more efficient method, which, of course, we all know as electric trolleys. Now, this picture here is of opening day in October 18th, 1888, of the first electric trolley line in the district. And here, well, the picture's fuzzy, but you see the poles here with the wires, and you can just sort of make out a trolley pole coming off of the car there. The word trolley, by the way, is because of that pole there. So the first cars, people look at them, they'd see that pole going along, and it sort of looked like an upside down fishing pole trolling in the water, except it's trolling that way. So that's why they're called them trolleys. So this was a big event. It's all these people here and all getting excited. This is this line in October 1888 was. This picture is on New York Avenue, just east of Mount Vernon Square, and that's where this line started. And it went out to the new suburb of Eckington. The name of this railway was the Eckington and Soldiers Home Railway. This was a great event. The newspapers talked about rapid transit. And this was the first rapid transit vehicle. So, and who knows how fast this car was going? 5. A little better than that. Sometimes 12. Usually, I mean, this line was set at 11 miles an hour. The normative speed. And the newspaper, again, the Star on this about this event, flying along New York Avenue, it says, which is brilliantly lit at night by the cluster of electric lights at the top of the iron poles. The occupants of the car, the first car, became conscious that they were creating something of a sensation. This was sensational, having this new car open. And yes, these poles had lights on them, so you had light at night, which was a new concept, of course. So everybody was excited. The Eckington development where this line was going was really the first true streetcar suburb, in my opinion, in DC, because it was the first time that a development was made where there was nothing before, deliberately designed with the streetcar system to go with it. As, of course, we're going to see Chevy Chase did the same thing, but this was the first one. This Colonel George Truesdell was the developer behind Eckington, and he had the belief and that was common at the time on the value of suburban life and fresh air and all that good stuff. Getting out of the city, and the Eckington. Let's see. I think the next slide again is an illegible map, but I will just show you the important thing. So here's the center of town, the White House, and over here is Mount Vernon Square, where the Carnegie Library is. That's where the railroad started, and it went out. Florida Avenue is along here, and Eckington is just right here. It's just outside of the old L'Enfant City, and this is where the line originally went. And so it didn't have very far to go, but still it gave you that having the streetcar there meant that you could live here and just be a matter of minutes before you could get into town, and that was a huge selling point for the suburb. And people moved out here to all the houses that Colonel Truesdell was building out there on that hill on Eckington. It was just great stuff, and it was electrically powered. There were lights on the street. There were lights in the streets of Eckington, one of the first communities in the area that got electric light, because he had a power station built there in Eckington. So great, everything is wonderful, right? Well, we have to think of our cautionary tale from Anacostia, and guess what? The same thing happened again in Eckington. The line was expanded out. It went out to Brooklyn. It said Eckington and Soldiers Home. It went north all the way up to Brookland. Truesdale found it was very expensive to run the thing. He ran it. He said he couldn't run streetcars more often than every 20 minutes, which is really not, if you have to wait 20 minutes for every bus or streetcar, that's not a satisfactory commuter option. He had built the power station. He had built a water pumping facility, and all these things. When he wanted to get out of the development, he tried to sort of sell them to the community, and people were very disappointed. They thought that all this package of the environment around them came with buying a house, and it didn't. Eventually, he wormed his way out of his various financial commitments, and the city took it over. There was all sorts of problems, promises made and broken. Eckington, and then the railroad, the regular railroad, the V&O railroad, started building around them, and it really, all of the excitement of the first days was lost ultimately. So things aren't looking good, and Chevy Chase is coming up. This isn't looking good, is it? But Chevy Chase is going to be different. So there were a number of electric streetcar suburbs that got started at this time. This is a shot of the Georgetown and Tenleytown line. Now that was an easy one to do once you had the electric power to get you up the hill, because you already had Wisconsin Avenue, what we call now Wisconsin Avenue, going up to Tenleytown's already there. So that was a gimme, right, to build that one out. The Brightwood Railway was another one. It went up Georgia Avenue to Brightwood and then Silver Spring. That's, again, it's all there. Definitely want to do that one. There's Washington and Great Falls Railway is the one that went along the river. Some people remember the Glen Echo line that eventually was along there. That was another one. And then, I have a map here, another illegible map. I hope I'm not boring everyone with these maps. I love maps, and I know you're having trouble seeing them. But here, 1895, we've gone out of the city, and we have lines. We have the Great Falls line here. We have the Eckington line going up this way, the Brightwood line going north. We have lines coming out to the east, and then we have this one here going straight up here, and it goes up to Chevy Chase. So that really stands out. Chevy Chase, I think, stands out from the earlier ones. And here we have our buddy, Francis Newlands. I think the Rock Creek Railway, which he was his brainchild, stands out as one of the both most ambitious and also most successful of the various suburban lines that got going. The Rock Creek Railway it was actually chartered in 1888. It was interesting. So it was chartered very close to the Eckington line and some of these others, and the Tenleytown and Brightwood, they were all chartered in 1888. It took a while to build the Rock Creek Railway, so it was actually behind the others chronologically. It was an effort in many ways, politically as well as logistically and financially. Newlands was not yet a member of Congress at this time. He was a private citizen, but he had made his fortune out west, as everyone knows, from silver, and he had friends in Congress, particularly Senator William Stewart, who really pushed his bill through. There was opposition. It was interesting to see when the bill to create this Rock Creek Railway to build Chevy Chase was put before Congress. There was a lengthy debate. The other side, led by David Henderson of Iowa, who was concerned that essentially that this was just a gift to developers. Where have we heard that story before, right? They said, why should we charter this road out in nowhere? Who's going to live out there? The people that are going to live out there are going to be wealthy people that, they can look after themselves. How is this going to help the common man of Washington in any way at all? And the answer is probably it didn't, but they got it approved anyway, like developers always get their way, right? So Newlands was no different. The quote I got, Henderson, he called it a bill to boom real estate in the District of Columbia. He had, nevertheless, it obviously it was approved. George Truesdell, the developer of Eckington, was also on board in Chevy Chase, as was Samuel Woodward of Woodward and Lothrop. So Newlands had a lot of powerful people behind him. The railway, here's a shot that I recently found of the bridge over Rock Creek. It's hard to find good pictures of that bridge. One of the biggest engineering feats, of course, was crossing Rock Creek Valley. That was the tough nut to crack. That's why development had not happened previously in Upper Northwest or beyond. And the biggest, there were two big bridges, one over Rock Creek Valley and one over Klingel Valley, that were built by the Rock Creek Railway. An investment of, I've found various quotes on how much money this whole thing cost. The Post in 1892 said nearly $3 million, which is, in 1892, $3 million, that's a lot of money. Anyway, the investment was made with Newlands and the other investors. There's a question back there.
Before you skip past 1888, you might want to explain why that year was so significant. That was when Sprague did his demonstration in Richmond of an electric railway. It was the first one.
That's right, that's right.
It just took off like wildfire. Anywhere anybody thought they could make money on it, there were proposals immediately.
That's right, yes. And there's a lot more to talk about, sort of the competition between cable and electric that was going on. But that's absolutely correct. The turning point was 1888. You notice I said there were all these railroads that were chartered, one after another in 1888. The demonstration that you're talking about in Richmond of how electricity was actually going to work was, I believe, in February of 1888. People had doubted that this electric thing was going to work. In particular, they thought, you've got that little wire that's carrying all the power for these cars. How is that really going to power all these cars? It just didn't seem reasonable, especially more than a couple cars. Like if you've got a whole city and you're going to have dozens of streetcars running at the same time, how are they going to get power out of that little thing? Just didn't make sense. So Sprague demonstrated how this thing actually really could work, and that was the turning point. So back to the Rock Creek Railway. Again, a huge investment. I have a quote when it finally opened in 1892 from a quote from the Post about, some of you have probably heard this one before, through woody glens and deep cuts, the road gradually climbs till Chevy Chase, the highest elevation in the district, is reached. This suburb, which is destined in a short while to rival all competitors, stands at an elevation of 500 feet above the Potomac. When the heat in the city is intense and citizens are sweating, the temperature on the heights along the Rock Creek Road is cooled by brisk breezes from the hills of Virginia. Chevy Chase is to be the most attractive village along the route. So high praise from the press of this new road going out. And I'm going to skip over all of the Chevy Chase Land Company buying property and all that, because I know you've heard all that before, and I'll just talk about the railway itself. And I've got a picture here, and again, you've probably seen this picture before of a car from the Rock Creek Railway. for those technical folks out there, these were interesting cars. They had this extra center wheel axle in addition to the usual wheels, trucks on either end, as most cars did. And this was called a Robinson truck, and it helped stabilize the cars. It was particularly valuable on this route that went such a long distance. It was 6.5 miles from the sort of terminus in town at 18th and Florida all the way out to Chevy Chase. So the cars would tend to rock around a lot, and these wheels stabilized them. So there was a lot of emphasis by Newlands and expense put into making this a comfortable, luxurious, if you will, ride out to. And these cars were fitted out, you know, with velvet interiors and very posh mahogany seating. These were elegant vehicles going out to this elegant new home. And I found another quote, a fun quote, speculating about how this great railway would succeed. And so, let's see, where's my map of the, I don't, anyway. The original route of the Rock Creek Railway went from the old Chevy Chase Lake was the northern terminus. That was chosen because the B&O Railroad crossed there, and so they could get supplies at that point. That was a great staging point to have the road end at the top. And the southern end, it crossed over that bridge, which is now where the Calvert Street Bridge is, and came down 18th Street to 18th and Florida. And they were going to build a connection across Florida to the other street railways. And the idea ultimately was everything in the city would be all connected up with Chevy Chase. So this quote from a technical magazine said the city terminus of the Rock Creek Railway will, without doubt, be in close proximity to the Capitol within 1 year. And this will afford congressmen an opportunity to step aboard an electric car and in 40 minutes, possibly less, be taken right to the door of their suburban homes without change of cars. It is not unreasonable to suppose that the time will come when this line will run special palace cars, heated and lighted with electricity, from the Capitol to Chevy Chase without stop, simply for the accommodation of senators and representatives. So that was the kind of top-tier, elite propaganda that was going on. Of course, I don't think there were any palace cars that ever traveled to Chevy Chase, but that's a good question. There's a lot. Again, I've got a lot.
Repeat the question.
Oh, I'm sorry. So the question was, well, what about the segregated city, and how does that fit in with this? That's a long, complicated topic, and I'll just answer it very briefly, probably too briefly. There's a lot I have in my book on that. I think the bottom line is that African Americans were not going to be traveling out to Chevy Chase as a practical matter, because they weren't going to be able to afford properties out there or to afford the costs. A streetcar ride from Chevy Chase into the city was 10 cents, and that's double the normal inside city rate of 5 cents. That was a standard 5-cent fare inside the city. So that alone, which cost you twice as much to get to and from work, it was basically going to be cost prohibitive to get out to Chevy Chase. And the developer, Newlands and the other developers were not thinking about access. That goes back to the discussion that I had about David Henderson's objections, the congressman from Iowa, that this railway was not going to help the common man, and that's valid. We have one more question. Sure.
But then maybe it's just a little bit later, but certainly in the 20s there were houses built in Chevy Chase that had the basement bathroom for the domestic. People were using, people had maids, people had domestic. How did they get to Chevy Chase if they couldn't live there?
Well, okay, so how did the domestics get to Chevy Chase? Yeah, I think they would, the only way anybody got there really was a streetcar. So they would have had to take the streetcar, and hopefully their employers would have given them consideration for the extra cost. But yeah, that was, the streetcars made, certainly for a suburb like Chevy Chase, which was developed whole cloth in connection with the streetcar, that was the lifeline. Everything came to and from the settlement in the early days by streetcar, including there were mail cars that were attached on. The post office would send mail by streetcars. You could order groceries. Prescriptions could be delivered from in town by streetcar. I haven't seen specifically how they got from the streetcar to the house, but I presume there were people were being paid to do that service, or people's own help was doing that. But yeah, everything was coming by streetcar. Here we have, this is a ticket book. You've probably seen these tickets, but I don't know if you've seen the whole ticket book for the Rock Creek Railway. It says down here, and boy, you can really not read that from here, can you? Rural homes with city conveniences is the slogan for Chevy Chase. That's printed on this advertisement that goes with the ticket book. Streetcar tickets were always sold in books of 6. Usually in town, that would be with tickets at 5 cents each. It would be a quarter for a book because you get an extra ticket if you buy a book of tickets. So I presume a Chevy Chase book would go for 50 cents. And I've got a couple more pictures related to the line. This one comes from a newspaper, so it's all grained over. But this is the terminus at Chevy Chase Lake. The cars coming along here. This is the car barn where they originally were stored at the end of the line. You see the trolley poles. You see this electric line coming in and going down, line going just right down to this building here. That's the original power station that was built at the lake to power the railroad and the houses of Chevy Chase.
Can we hold our questions till the end, or we won't have the time for questions and answers?
So,
Thank you.
okay, we'll do that, yes.
I want you to get through your lecture.
I appreciate that. How am I doing on time, by the way?
Good, you're about 5 till 5.
Okay.
We're gonna lay start. It's north.
Yeah, and I'll sort of pick up the pace, I think, from here. This is another picture. This is the other end of the line. So this is down at 18th and Florida Avenue. It's very, very elegant poles here for the electricity over the top. At this point, as I said, they wanted to connect the line to the other streetcar lines, and they built a line along Florida Avenue U Street to connect over to the existing lines on 7th and 9th Streets. And that was there's another big story about electricity in the city. The law that Congress passed requiring streetcar companies to transition from horses to some other form of power also prohibited them from using those overhead wires inside the original L'Enfant City. And that caused all sorts of trouble, consternation, and there are experiments of all sorts going on. But the Chevy Chase line, the Rock Creek Railway, was the first one to build an underground conduit electrical system along U Street. They were the pioneers. And that eventually was the solution that everybody adopted inside the city, was to have electricity underground. So I have a few more slides about sort of the life on the streetcars. And so we'll lighten it up a bit. Here's a great shot of one of the open cars that, this is actually from the Metropolitan Railroad in DC, but the same kind of cars ran to Chevy Chase. So in the warmer months, these open cars ran. As you can see, they've got benches that run all the way across the length of the car, and there's a running board here, a long ledge that you'll hop up from here and then get in and take your place, and you're just sort of hanging out there in the wind. They must have been a lot of fun. Safety-wise, there's a reason why we don't have them anymore, but they were used all over the place. And there's stories about one of the things. As you can imagine, it's a straight bench all the way across. So if you're getting on here and you're going a ways, where are you going to sit? You're going to sit on the end, right, so that you can get back off. You're not going to go file in. The other side, the street side of the car, would be blocked off with a bar going across it, so to keep people from falling out or stepping out into the middle of the road. So you'd have to climb in here if you wanted to get a seat. And this gave rise to the phenomenon of the end-seat hog, which I just love this story. This is a cartoon that ran in the Star in 1907 by Clifford Berryman, the famous cartoonist, of the end-seat hog. Here's this guy sitting on the end and people trying to, the old lady and the women and the kids and all, and they can't get in because this guy won't move. So this was a well documented part of life on the streetcars. And even if you didn't have end-seat hogs, you still a lot of people had trouble getting on these cars. Here's a picture of women trying to board in the early 1910s. You can see that's kind of a challenge, just to get up here and on to the skirts. Yes, and this is sort of. And here's this. I love this guy sitting here looking like, oh, I don't care what's going on. And here these people are trying to get on, and he's just sitting there. You also have another interesting fact you can note here. The conductor is here on the end. You can see he's got a conductor's, trust me, he's got a conductor's cap. And he was in charge, of course. The conductors had to go around and collect fares from everybody. That's the way it worked. You just get in, on, and off. Once you're on a streetcar, the conductor came and collected your fare. So he had to walk along. He's carrying his change machine and his tickets and all that. And he's got to balance himself on here. And people may be standing on the side. He's got to walk around them and lean in and extract fares from people. And this is an incredibly dangerous job. And as you can imagine, I did find some cases of accidents. There was one guy out not in the Chevy Chase line, a conductor who leaned way out to get around people standing on the running board and was struck and hit a trolley pole as the car went by. So it could be very dangerous. And again, another reason why they don't have them anymore. But back to the women. So this is the early 1900s, 1910. 1910, does anybody know why 1910 is important in terms of women's fashion? The hobble skirt. The hobble skirt is just a cool little story because that happened right at the peak of these streetcars, and this I don't know how they got on anything at all with that, but there was actually right in 1910 there was a group of women in Upper Northwest that actually organized to petition the streetcar companies to come up with cars with lower steps so that they could get on even if they weren't wearing hobble skirts. And this eventually led to cars like this, with a door in the center that had that opened up and the steps came down, and it was much easier to get on. So that's just a little comment about life. And I'm going to have to hurry through my next slides pretty quickly, I think. But the end of streetcars for Chevy Chase came fairly early. And the big development, of course, in general, was automobiles and buses. The Washington Rapid Transit Company was the first big major bus company. Here they got a line of their buses in 1921. Buses spelled the end of streetcars. And buses were considered much more sophisticated. They were the luxury way of traveling by mass transit by the time they came around. And one of the first lines that where there was competition directly between buses and streetcars was the Connecticut Avenue line to Chevy Chase. They ran the two of them, and the buses cost more than the streetcars because they were more elegant. So there you go. And in fact, the trolley service to Chevy Chase ended in 1935. It's one of the first. It was the first major line in the district to convert from streetcars to buses. Again, now why would they pick the Chevy Chase line to shut down first? It makes sense if you invert your head and get around the way people thought then. The buses were the technology of the future. They were the advanced technology. So Chevy Chase being the well-to-do suburb was the first one that got this advanced service and got rid of that nasty old streetcar that everybody hates. And this article in the Post, people are going on about, the trip downtown was much faster and smoother than before. One Connecticut Avenue homeowner said, well, we certainly are glad the old streetcars are off the street. One of them made more noise than a dozen of these new buses. So, now we think streetcars are quiet and efficient and clean. All those arguments were used against them when the buses first came along. Streetcar, there's a lot more about the 20th century in the book I don't have time for. The last streetcar anywhere in the district was in 1962. Sort of the last point I have a few slides. Here's a picture in Georgetown. I have this picture because this particular car here, which was called car number 766, was a car off of the Chevy Chase line. It had been saved in the 30s by the early effort of streetcar fans who knew that the streetcars were going to die one day. And they convinced Capital Transit Company, which was the heir of all the previous companies, they convinced Capital Transit to save one of these cars for fan trips. And this one also ran on the very last day of streetcars. Here it is down on U Street by the Howard Theater with the banner "Last Day of Streetcars." It had the black wreath on the front. These cars, some of you probably remember that in '62, everyone rode on the last week or so to get in their last ride before they were all gone. And that car landed at the National Capital Trolley Museum, where you're all going to go and visit. Here's a shot of the museum. This isn't the car, but here's a shot of that same car at the Trolley Museum in 1970. I won't falsely get your hopes up. The particular car you will not be able to ride on when you go out there. This is how it looks now. It's being restored. It was all the incorrect changes have been taken off of it, so it's not serviceable at the moment. But it is in the process of being restored, and eventually, I'm sure we'll be running there. In the meantime, they have a bunch of other ones that are other trolley cars running that are a lot of fun to get on and experience the old way, the old life of trolley cars. So That is all I have. I hope I haven't run too far over my time. So, thank you very much. So, questions? A few questions. Yes, ma'am.
What street was the Capital Car Barn on in Chevy Chase? You know, where you had the power station? What street is that today?
That was, so where was the car barn? It was just off of Connecticut Avenue. What is?
But where on the side street?
Oh.
Chevy Chase Village Hall.
Oh,
Yeah, the big office
Yes,
building
yes.
sitting on the side of the car barn. Chevy
Yes.
Chase Lake Rock.
Right. The lake is gone, of course, and the tracks, the B&O tracks still cross the road right there. So it was just immediately before those tracks, essentially, on the eastern side. Yes.
The Washington Post article talks about 62 buses taking over from the streetcars. How many streetcars were there? 62 buses?
So,
How many trolleys?
well, good question. I don't know the answer to that. They would have had enough, probably about the same. They would have had enough to keep a headway of 5 minutes or so. You would never, generally, you didn't want to have a space between cars of more than about 5 minutes. Yes, sir.
I think this is true, and I'm sure someone in the room can correct me if I'm wrong, that there are DC Transit streetcars in service in San Francisco. Correct.
Well, not, okay, the statement or the suggestion was that there are DC streetcars running in San Francisco. In San Francisco, and it's not quite true. They have the San Francisco Market Street line runs vintage streetcars that have come from various places. They have one of them that is painted in the DC Transit colors, but it is not a DC Transit car. It is, I believe it's from Toronto. I'm not sure about that. But it's in DC Transit colors. And the first time I went to San Francisco and got on that car, I was so excited to be on a DC Transit streetcar. And then I discovered that it was not really true. But anyway, yes.
I ran across an account somewhere in the past that General Motors was buying up streetcar lines in Los Angeles to do in the lines and promote buses. I take it from your remarks that was not a nefarious plot here in the district. It was technological advance, comfort advance.
Yes, that's true. So the question is about the famous conspiracy theory that General Motors, and the theory goes that General Motors, Firestone, and Standard Oil conspired to force streetcars off of the streets of American cities. It is. I have something more in the book about that whole conspiracy theory. It's basically completely untrue. There was a court ruling about an antitrust ruling that was the source of that, but the fact is people were glad to get rid of the streetcars on the whole. Not every single person, of course, but most people were very happy to get rid of them, and they didn't need to have any conspiracy to do it. So, yes, I'll get your second, him first.
Are the tracks under the pavement on Connecticut Avenue still there?
I'm not sure about Connecticut. It's been a long time since the streetcars ran in Connecticut. I know recently Wisconsin Avenue, Tenley, the Tenleytown line ran until I think 58, much later, and some of those rails are still there. I know for sure that there are streetcar rails still under streets in the district at various points. I don't know, and I sort of doubt that there are any in Connecticut Avenue. Yes, sir.
Where did the money come to finance the streetcars? It must have taken a tremendous amount of capital.
They did. The streetcar investments took a lot of capital. There would be big investors and developers like Francis Newlands would be the people that would build out the streetcar lines.
Is this all private?
It was all private, yes. The lines were. We've never had a public streetcar in Washington. They were all private until the very end, until they were until they were phased out under Roy Chalk and DC Transit. So, yeah. Yeah.
Did Newlands get his money back? I mean, the investment in the bridge was, in today's dollars, in the billions.
Right.
And it would have taken a lot of nickels and dimes.
Yes, it would. Now, I don't think he ever, in his lifetime, no, he personally, he did not get his money back. He had plenty of other, as I'm sure you know, he had plenty of other sources of income. And he didn't need to make money on it. And he had that advantage over smaller investors like poor old Henry Griswold and Anacostia, who just couldn't afford to keep going. The Chevy Chase Land Company, from what I understand, did not make any money until after World War I. It was just not profitable. There were the financial panic of 1893 in the early days kept sales down. And the Rock Creek Railway, which became part of Capital Traction Company, did not make money. So, ultimately, he was give it 50 years, and then you'll make some money, a lot of money. Anybody else?
How did Cleveland Park, or how did Chevy Chase piggyback with Cleveland Park streetcars?
There weren't any streetcars specifically for Cleveland Park. That was along the way to Chevy Chase. That was the Rock Creek Railway went the whole schmear from 18th and Florida in town. They built the bridge and built the whole line out to Chevy Chase, and everybody along the way was just gravy on the way, as it were. So Cleveland Park was on the way.
And
Yes.
just a clarification, you had said, and maybe I misunderstood you, that the bridge they built is now the Calvert Street Bridge? I thought it was the Taft Bridge.
No, it was Calvert Street. Yeah, Calvert Street. So the line came down to Woodley Park, and then basically shoehorned over and came down 18th. So the Taft Bridge, there was a low bridge before the Taft Bridge, also a steel bridge, similar in look and design, but it was very low, and so you had to come down the hill on the city side, the Calorama side. You came down a hill to that bridge and crossed over, and then went up a steep hill to Woodley Park. So that was not going to work for a streetcar. It was too rugged, and they'd have to redo that. And I think it's shorter distance where Calvert Street is. So they came down, so they used that route and came down 18th. It wasn't, Taft Bridge, of course, wasn't built till 1903 or 1906, somewhere in the early 1900s. Yes?
What are the tracks on O Street in Georgetown?
So that original line, that was a fairly early line in the 1870s that was built originally as an extension. I mentioned the second company was called the Metropolitan Railroad. It had cross-town lines. One of them ended up at DuPont Circle, and they built in 1872, they built the line from DuPont Circle west that came over on O Street and looped back on P Street. And so there's that stretch now that has been preserved just as an historical memento. But yes, that's originally that's how that got started. Are we out of time now, I guess?
I just want to thank John so much for being here today, and he will. He will be here signing books if you're interested. Now, yes, we have the evaluation forms. Catherine, do you have a way to pick up the forms? Because I want to draw for, if you would, just take a minute to fill out the forms. And while you're doing that, I'd like to just let everybody know this year, 2016, is the Historical Society's 35th anniversary. So we're very proud of being around since 1981, and we hope we can continue bringing you interesting, fascinating programs like today's.